We are diving into another topic of context engineering, which is the semantic layer. Before we get into it, a little bit by myself, mostly an entrepreneur, background as a data scientist, now building another AI consulting company. I'm actually hiring junior AI engineer in London, so if anyone knows anyone, please come to me later. We're talking about context over prompts, and we are specifically talking about the semantic layer and why is that important. Before we dive into it, I have a question for the audience. How many of you have built a text-to-SQL application or any kind of AI application that involves querying a SQL database, basically? Okay, good. All right, nice, very nice. Okay. So this is like one of the tweets that also Mike referenced before, like Toby looked, say, okay, now it's time of context engineering. I think like we are all aligned on this. So we moved from just like optimizing the prompt, but optimizing more the whole set of information that we give to the LLM to do a task, right? And when it comes to building like text to SQL or any kind of like data heavy AI application, we mostly fail if we don't give enough context about the data that we are feeding them, right? So in most organizations, the data is very fragmented, like the definition of a metric differs team by team, always within the team they might differ, like what's the gross margin, what's revenue? Those are like questions that always are unanswered, like in most cases. And also the LLMs like hallucinate if they don't know the answer to those questions because they don't know how to behave. They might behave in one like manner one time, in another manner another time if you don't tell them. The third thing is that like the business logic is not in SQL, so the LLM doesn't know what the business is about, and this is like pretty important when building an application that is basically a de facto AI data scientist, if you will. So just imagine that you are hiring a data scientist in your company and say, oh, this is the data, you have no context about my business at all, good luck with that. That's very unlikely to end up in a very good situation. So as I said, I've been a data scientist. This is nothing new. Before we always said like shit in, shit out, and that's also the case with generative AI. So it was the case with machine learning. It was the case with artificial intelligence. And what kind of semantic we use, generative AI, agentic AI, is always the same. If we give like bad data in, we get bad data out. So what the heck is a semantic layer? I'm not like big on semantics, I would say, but like these are definition that I try to give. So a semantic layer for AI, specifically for the AI use case, is a business-friendly abstraction that sits between raw data and AI applications, translating complex technical data into understandable business concepts and relationships. So what that means is that we put a layer between the raw data, so let's say between our raw database, and the AI. If we don't put this layer, the AI will most likely hallucinate. If we put this layer, we will get more reliable and consistent results. What this does is just mapping like the technical schema, so the schema of your database, your data warehouse, your tables in the data warehouse specifically, to business-friendly concepts. So explains to the LLM, explains to the AI what this data is about. And we will see some example later, but beyond just explaining like the table, it also explains how this data relates to each other, right? So let's imagine you have a very big data warehouse, you are a payment company or a fintech company. You have the transaction table, the customers table, you have like the refunds table, right? How those like concepts, like those assets talk to each other is explained in the semantic layer. Just like another example, there is no AI without consistent data, and with the rise of agentic AI, this is becoming more and more like important, especially if you build like multi-step agentic systems that always pull like from the same data set. It's always important to tell them what is this data set about. Lastly, like you have like huge benefits if you put like a universal semantic layer across the whole organization, because you make it not only reliable but also consistent. That's the other part, right? So you want the LLM to like give like good results, but you want also the LLM to give always the same results, right? So the worst case scenario is like asking a data scientist, what's my revenue in the last 7 days? And they will answer, oh, my revenue in the last 7 days is like 300K, and then you ask them again after 2 minutes, and they say 500K. I think like that's the worst case scenario. So what are the components of the semantic layer? So the anatomy, you have a metric store that centralizes all the definition of your KPIs. So clearly says, okay, we define gross margin as the sum of these other metrics. And these other metrics are defined in this way. There is a modeling layer that, as I said before, maps all the concepts together, right? Says, okay, the customer table can be joined to the transaction table on the customer ID that is available in both tables and is defined in this way. Usually a semantic layer has like some, let's say, developer tools, API, SDKs that make it interoperable. So it can be used in AI systems and also in other systems, right? Like this is like an AI Meetup, but the semantic layer can be used also for your BI tool, like for example. There is, of course, like as all software, lineage, you want lineage tracking and version control to trace changes and I see how the semantic layer evolve, and this will come back at the very end of the talk. So an example, this is a very, very simple example of a semantic layer, or I would say a part of it, like the core part of it. So you have a definition of metrics with some properties, right? For example, what the model, like in this case would be a model is a table in the data warehouse, and other properties that describe the metric, and you have dimensions. So a classic example might be customer that has like some metrics like revenue or like gross margin, something like that, and then some dimensions like country or like other business dimension that you can define. Of course, like it can be it's usually much more complex than this, but it usually comes in a YAML file or similar YAML file taxonomy. Now, there's been a big announcement yesterday that I didn't put in the slides, but Snowflake, together with other big players in the industry, are coming up with a sort of like unified way to define the semantic layer, which has been a huge problem in the industry, and I think also the main reason why the semantic layer didn't get the traction that I think deserves, right? Because everyone would try to come up with their own semantic layer. Looker has his own semantic layer. dbt has his own semantic layer. And now the industry has understood that like to make the semantic layer, like democratize the semantic layer, I would say, we need a unified kind of like system. So that's huge news. Now that we've seen like what the heck is this semantic layer, a little bit of impact, like why, like if I go to a business, say, hey, before doing this application, we must like build a semantic layer, they will ask me why, like what's the return of investment? And I usually like show like this slide and then like the paper like later, you have a huge improvement in accuracy compared to zero shot, like just like SQL like ask, right? So just by adding the semantic layer. So this is the paper I'm referring to. It's not a new one. I think like there is like research coming up, but that's like a huge improvement. Like so the main number is like the improvement from 16% to 54%, and you might say, oh, 54 is not like great. Yes, building text to SQL agents is pretty hard. And I would say without like a proper mapping of your business context is even harder. So here you can notice that there is no semantic layer written anywhere. We're talking mostly about like knowledge graph. So this leads like to the second part of the talk where we try to understand what's the difference between a semantic layer, an ontology, and a knowledge graph. Now, the premise is that I think it's mostly semantics. A lot of people think different things. I don't want like to say this is the truth, but that's how I map them, like at least in my mind. So for example, like Palantir has the ontology, and in their like view, the ontology is both the semantic layer and the knowledge graph, and I think that they have like fair points for that, right? So that's just like an attempt to try to give like some clear definitions and try to understand the differences. So the semantic layer, the purpose is barely to describe what's the data, right? So you want to have an abstraction that translates, again, complicated data models into unified business-friendly concepts. I will not go through the whole last slide, but that's kind of the main thing. So it's just like describing metric and dimensions. The ontology adds a piece to it. So think about it as something on top of the semantic layer that also defines how the object within the company, let's say, have action between each other. So a customer can make a transaction. So there is a kinetic movement, there is a direction that goes from customer to transaction. And this kind of kinetic movement is mapped into the ontology. The third one is the knowledge graph that brings all of this together. So you can think about it as a sort of like big documentation that puts all the components of a company into a big graph and describes how they relate to each other and how they are defined via the semantic layer. So an analogy that I use to try to explain the differences and show how they work together is a menu and receipt analysis. So the ontology sets like the rules and the definition is like the menu. The semantic layer is like the specific recipe for the dish that you have seen on the menu, right? And it makes very practical for specifically the data use case, like so answering data questions. The knowledge graph applies to both, right? And try to contextualize like the rules between the entities and the information about the data. So how to implement it? First of all, it's very important that your business defines the definitions, right? So in my experience, that's like more complex than what I thought originally. So you sit down with your business and you say, okay, what's a gross margin? Like usually with finance metrics is always hard. What's the gross margin? What's COGS? How do we define COGS, right? Those are questions. Or when a transaction is considered completed. When a transaction is pending. You want to, if you have this information in your data warehouse, you want to clearly describe what is going on. Then you want to document it as code or as an ontology. So here, like you might want to use like YAML files or some kind of specific language that helps you to have also Markdown. I've seen like some semantic layers in Markdown, not a big fan, but can also work. And third one, make this layer accessible. So again, like adding some tools to make this layer accessible to API RAG agents, basically agents, and also other applications eventually. Now, this kind of like process has been very hard, like in the last few years, because usually you use different tools, and then maybe those tools don't really apply to other frameworks you use. An example might be, let's say you use dbt as your data transformation tool, and dbt as a component, a semantic layer component. It's not like being very interoperable with other like AI frameworks, right? So you need to be like the integration yourself. It might be hard. I do think that with the new initiative by Snowflake, we will get to a place where this will become very, very, very easy. And finally, very important, you want also to create a feedback loop to try to understand what part of the semantic layer must be improved. Like it's not really a science, or again, like maybe you can like set a feedback loop that auto improves itself and we will see it. But still, like the way you describe the metrics, the way you describe the dimensions, the way you map your data and the entities in your business, it's something that you need to continuously improve and test on your real data. So if you build a text to SQL application, if you build any kind of like, let's say data analyst AI application, the feedback that you get, the accuracy that you get from your queries must inform improvements to the semantic layer, because the semantic layer is the asset that will make that application reliable and consistent as well. Now, let's say like we have implemented the semantic layer, we are a very big company. There is one challenge left, which is improving and most importantly, keeping the semantic layer updated. So metrics change, business context change. You need the semantic layer to follow that. What we have done so far is like doing it manually, but that might be very tricky in very big organization where the data team or whoever is in charge of owning the semantic layer is not really like aware of any business change that might happen or aware of all the data changes that happen. So something that is happening in the industry is this concept of self-updating agentic semantic layer, where you build an agentic system to improve or at least suggest improvements to the semantic layer. This is pretty early on. It's something I've never tried myself. There are a couple of companies that are working on it specifically. So I'm very excited to see how this goes. But that's basically the next step that you need to build a sort of autonomous feedback loop on your semantic layer. So to wrap it up, my advice in building data-heavy agentic systems, treat all LLMs as very dumb and cocky data analysts. So they will always assume they can find the answer, or they will never tell you as a very experienced data scientist, oh, actually, I don't really know what you mean by gross margin. They will tell you, oh, the gross margin of the last 3 weeks is this one. Second one is give them context and boundaries. Boundaries is important as well, and that's part of the semantic layer. So you need to whip a little bit the cocky data analyst. And third, we have just seen it, make sure you ensure that the context evolves with business. A classic error is okay, we have built the semantic layer doesn't really change as the business change. That's usually when there is a big gap between the information that we have and the information that we have mapped to the AI system. That's pretty it.